Hey everyone, Dr. Ben here, Functional Medicine Centers. Welcome. So excited to have you on board today. We're going to be talking about COVID testing. We're going to be talking about PCR testing, what a positive test means, what a positive infection means, what a positive case means, all these different things. It's confusing out there. You see a lot of different information. Want to boil it down a little bit, tell you exactly what's going on, why we're seeing such a discrepancy between positive cases versus positive actual infections, and what this actually means, and why testing really isn't as accurate as they like to make it sound it is. All right, Functional Medicine Centers, Fort Collins, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona. Love to get the underlying why of what's going on. If you haven't liked or followed our page already, go ahead and hit those buttons. For anybody that you're talking with about COVID testing, about PCR tests, that is curious, that you think would find this information interesting, go ahead and share this on your page. We love getting the information out there. All right, ready? So here we go. The traditional test that has been done for months and months is what's called the PCR test. And that's the one, there's some great videos online. Give me a thumbs up if you guys have seen those, where people, they've got the camera right next to their head, and it looks like it goes about that far into their brain when they're testing that one. So that's the swab test. So if any of you guys have had that one done, they're swabbing in that nasal passage, trying to get enough material, and then they're running it into the test and the lab. So through this process, when everybody said, hey, everybody needs to be tested, everybody needs to be tested lots of times, even if you're not showing symptoms. There are some of those thumbs up there, pretty extreme. Also, if you guys are jumping on board, go ahead and let me know where you're watching from. Love to hear where everybody's from, all over the United States, all over the world. Just let us know where you're watching, and any questions, any comments you have, go ahead and put those down below. I'll try to get to those throughout the course of this video here. So here's what happens. Everybody in government and media and all these places say, oh my gosh, we've got to have more testing. Testing is the answer. And so what do? Well, they start testing everybody as much as possible, but there's not as much out there as far as labs doing this testing. So the FDA starts approving as many as they possibly can, just giving out, it's called the Emergency Use Approval, EUA approval, and just saying, hey, yes, you're good, test. And there's really no oversight on a lot of these. And really, for labs, there's an incentive to have more positives, because that's going to get you more people coming back getting more tests. Because if one person has a positive, they've probably been around 100 people that are going to go, oh no, I might have been exposed to them, and guess what, I better go get tested. And then guess what, there's a high chance that there's other false positives that are coming out of that as well. So this PCR test, they do what's called a cycle threshold, meaning that they run it through, run the material through so many times. Hey Robert, good to see you there in Mesa. They run it through so many times, so many cycles through, and the more cycles through, the more sensitive it becomes. There was a great article in the New York Times back in August, and New York Times, they've got their own issues, but this is probably one of the better articles they've put out in a long time. Did a lot of research into this, and they found that they were running 40 cycles for that threshold. And really what the research is showing is that they should be doing about 30 cycles. And even the NFL, we're going to be talking about the NFL here in a few minutes, even the NFL found this, and this is why they are still playing, why they still have so many people still on the field, is that they put that cycle down to where it actually should be. So as opposed to being up at that 40 cycles, and the research showed that they're getting basically fragments of genetic material out of that PCR test. So they swab, and that 90% of the people in this New York Times article, 90% of the people that they found had positive tests, were not infectious, they were not contagious, they did not have any type of that true infection going on, and a lot of them were at the level where it was fragments of genetic material. So think about that. How problematic is somebody going to be if they have fragments of genetic material? And the New York Times piece, they were interviewing all these researchers, scientists, and looking through the data, and found that 90% of the people that were coming back positive on that test, guess what? They weren't even a true infection. They should not be considered a positive. So is this a false positive? You could consider it a false positive, and yet it's not going to be telling us whether somebody is truly sick, whether they need to quarantine. They said 90% of the people that come back with positive tests on the PCR, on the traditional 40 cycles that they're running, should not have to quarantine. So think about that. We're getting 40,000, 50,000, 30,000, however many positive tests a day, have nothing to do, and the news media, they say, it's positive cases. So that's BS as well, because a case, for me, I would consider a case somebody, they've got a runny nose, they've got a cough, they've got all these things going on, and yet they're not positive in the sense that they're actually sick. So it's not just a positive case, so now you're positive and you need to isolate and all those things. A positive case, they call a positive test. Those are two different things in my world. And so a positive test, now we know, doesn't mean much of anything. 90% of the positive tests are not truly positive infection. So there was another interesting thing. Georgia State University, 2 weeks ago, they had a football game had to be canceled because the 4 people on the team, let me know if any of you guys saw this one out there, 4 people on the team tested positive, and the lab admitted, hey Bonnie, good to see you out there in the Sandhills. The lab admitted that the test was read incorrectly. It was a human error. The test was read incorrectly. I'm like, you're doing this every single day, and people's lives are in your hands, and you read it incorrectly, which is pretty bizarre. So it was a human error test. Georgia State, they went and retested all of those people the next day. They all came back negative. They tested again, the sample that they sent in, and those were negative as well. So this team lost an entire football game. The NFL, back in August as well, they had 77 positive tests in one day. I don't know if you guys saw this one or not, but they had 77 positive tests in one day. And the NFL has done a great job. They set their cycles a whole lot lower, closer to that 30 level. So for one thing, they're not getting all these false positives, but sometimes it does happen. And so they had 77 positive tests. They retested all of those the same day and got the results back. They were all negative. And they tested, the NFL, if they get a positive test, they test 2 more times in the same day. Hey, Jason, great question there. If all these cases are not cases, what does that do to the mortality rate? Well, it does the same thing to the mortality rate because, when you've got, in theory, I go more off the CDC as opposed to the Johns Hopkins, which is over 200,000. But that puts those 200,000 at probably 90% of those are not COVID cases as well. So it's going to do very similar things to that. But that's a great question. Hey Heather, good to see you. Frustrating. It is. It's confusing and frustrating, and a lot of people are not quite sure what to look at. So what the NFL has done is, if they get one positive test, they test it again twice in that same day and see. And if they both of those come back negative, they don't even report it. Versus, if somebody comes back positive and the local media gets a hold of it, or the government or whatever, boom, it gets reported and it's right away. There was one of my team members, she lives in a small town east of Fort Collins here, and they had a positive test for one of their middle school or high school kids, and they sent out an email, said, oh my gosh, this is a positive test, we're going to have to shut this down. And the doctor that was working with that kid said, you know what, this is weird, you're not having really the right symptoms or anything like that, let's go ahead and retest it. Guess what, it came back negative. They said, oh, actually we can keep going to school, everything's fine. But not everybody is retesting like that. So a lot of people are not retesting, and so then we get this 90% in there as well. Hey, Sonny, how accurate is the rapid test? I cannot give a comment on that yet. I have not seen any official reports on the accuracy of the rapid test, and it can't be much worse than the PCR. Let's look at it that way. The PCR, really, they're not suitable for detecting or giving a diagnosis, especially when there's no symptoms. There's no symptoms to, hey, Jonas, good to see you out there. There's no symptoms. How can you say that's a true infection, especially when we're spinning these things 40 times and having fragments of genetic material and then saying, oh my gosh, we're going to add you to the caseload. So that's a huge part of this process. The other interesting part with the NFL and why they're feeling so confident putting those cycles down low, even at that 30 level, is that NFL players, they are basically statistically harmless, meaning dudes in their 20s and 30s, very healthy, very fit guys, have basically zero risk of COVID. And what we know is that people under 40, the flu has higher fatality than COVID does for that group. Bucko's feed and freight. Yes, so you think people should test again if they have a positive test? Absolutely. With as much information that's out there, you should definitely, and you should also ask the lab how many cycles, what's their cycle threshold? They call it their CT. Check their cycle threshold, because if that cycle threshold is up at 40, you want to go to a lab that's down at like 35, 32, even 30, and really know if it's a true infection as opposed to whether it's just fragments of genetic material. So I absolutely would get a second test done, but I would make sure of what that lab is testing and knowing that that it's probably not going to be as accurate if they're running up at that 40 level on there. So the NFL, they feel very comfortable with what they're doing as well as a lot of these athletic programs out there, because the COVID is statistically harmless to that age group, to that 20 to 30 something year old healthy male, has zero chance of getting a severe infection or dying from COVID. The research is showing that there's much higher rates of fatality and severe infection from flu for that group than there is from COVID. Sure, as someone ages and they get the comorbidities and they get more of the inflammatory process and all of that, sure, there's greater risk for somebody having problems. Even with President Trump, he's a little bit overweight. He's probably got some metabolic syndrome. I know, is he drinking Diet Coke all day, I think? Somebody type down below if he's drinking Diet Coke. But he's for whatever reason probably not eating as great as he should be. So he is a little bit on that side. I don't think he's fully diagnosed with diabetes or anything else. So I think he's going to be fine, and he's going to come over this. And what was really interesting, they announced that he's taking zinc, he's taking melatonin, he's taking vitamin D, a lot of the things that we've been talking about this whole time, and he's actually coming along doing really well. But if we would have said that, and said, hey, take this protocol to fix your COVID, I could have been shut down if I would say it like that, and yet that's what they're giving him. So pretty interesting. What we know is that PCR tests really are not suitable to diagnose anybody with COVID. It's not a very good test. Then they go ahead and test it into a much higher CT, so that threshold, that number of cycles threshold, they are doing way too many of those. They're doing at least 40 of them for a lot of these labs. It's fragments of genetic material. There's lab error, just like Georgia State football team. They had positive tests, but it was a lab error. The lab admitted it. No one was really sick, and they could have actually played the game. The NFL had 77 positive tests in one day. They went and retested everybody twice again in that same 24-hour period. All came back negative. These lab errors, these lab tests happen all the time. So what do we have to do? Well, one, you have to keep your body as strong as possible. And no matter what comes at you, you've got to have your vitamin D where it needs to be. You've got to be sleeping. You've got to be eating well, keeping your blood sugar stabilized. If you are pre-diabetic or diabetic or insulin resistant, give us a holler. We can change that in as little as 6 to 8 weeks. You can be non-diabetic. Absolutely possible. That's the number one thing that you're going to be able to do to change your risk of COVID. Number two, you're going to be able to get your vitamin D up into that 60 to 80 range, and that's going to be the next step to do. You've got to give your body the best chance possible to fight it off, because it's gonna come. We're going to be exposed. Thank goodness in Colorado already went through back in March and April. We had a spike then. We're not going to have another spike because it did go through. We know what's happening after looking at countries and states all over the world, and it's already gone through. There isn't this big second wave that they're talking about. That's really not how most viruses are working, and that's definitely not how this one is working. So, should you get a second test done if you do test positive? I certainly would. I absolutely, especially if you don't have symptoms or very mild symptoms, and so you can see that change. Jennifer, great question. How long does it take to bring your vitamin D up from 20? Well, it depends on how much you're taking. So for somebody in that 20 range, let's say they're taking 10,000 IU a day, it's probably going to take a couple months to get it up into the 40s and 50s through there. Make sure you're getting some sunshine as well. But yeah, it probably is going to take a month or two, about as long as it's going to take you to reverse your insulin resistance, prediabetes or diabetes. So totally doable. All these things can change. So if you know anybody out there that is curious about this information, that really wants to know what is going on with the testing and why it's so kind of bunk on both sides, let's share this out there with as many people as you can. We love getting the information out. All right, guys, make it a great day and stay strong out there. Bye-bye.